Hey, Retcon Raider here. So, yet another year is coming to an end. And what a year it has been. As always, I'm not really going to dig into the gruesome details, but suffice to say it has been interesting. I mean, even ignoring all of the more serious issues I think most of us are dealing with right now, it's strange to me to realize that this is going to be the end of my third full year on YouTube. Oh, sure, technically it's closer to about 3.5 years at this point. I think my first video started rolling out way back in April of 2017, but I don't think I really started taking it seriously until we got into the first couple of quarters of 2018. By that point, I had gotten shoutouts from a few developers, I had upgraded my old rig with some actual recording equipment, and I had even set up a Patreon. Something that I still feel a bit weird about from time to time, but hey, it pays the bills. Well, some of them anyway. Regardless, here we are, heading on into 2021, and what I suppose is going to be the first year where I try to essentially treat this as more of an actual job than just a glorified hobby. That said, I still have no idea what that's actually going to entail. As always, I am really just making this up as I go along. But I'll probably figure something out. Anyway, let's go ahead and have a look at the numbers, shall we? Now, despite all of that vaguely uplifting stuff that I was just chattering about, I suppose I should start with the fact that we are, of course, headed into the usual Q4 slump. This is actually something I've talked about before, and it is something that used to alarm me. But given that this is now my fourth time going through it, it's honestly no big deal. Although our numbers back in August and September were halfway decent, it's been tapering off pretty steadily ever since then. In fact, while our views back in September almost cracked 100,000, they just barely cracked 60,000 in November. Side note, I will say, it is actually hilarious to me that I'm even saying 60,000 views like it's a bad thing. Those are numbers I could only dream about back when I was first getting started. Honestly, there are multiple reasons for the current downward trending, none of which come as a surprise. Obviously, we just touched on the whole Q4 slump thing, and that's likely to continue until we get out towards spring. Aside from that, my upload schedule has gotten a little more sporadic as we've dug into a couple of more complex CRPGs. Less uploads, of course, equates to less overall views. But it is worth noting that these videos have been, on average, about a quarter to a third longer than my previous average runtimes. You can actually see that reflected in the numbers from back in October, where the overall view count dropped by about 15%. But the overall watch time actually increased by a like percentage. That reflects how, despite the fact that I was uploading less videos, the folks who were watching them were sticking around to actually watch the entire things. While that did result in a small but notable drop-off in the overall ad revenue for the month, it was to such a trivial degree that it was easily absorbed by the increase in my monthly patronage. Of course, then, once you get into November, you can see that the numbers went down in almost every category. This basically marks the beginning of the Q4 slump, with the sharpest drop-offs coming right as we were getting out towards Thanksgiving, but it was also exacerbated by an even more irregular upload schedule. Unfortunate, but at that point I was grappling with major bug issues in Baldur's Gate 3, as well as Wasteland 3, and I had some recurring issues with copyright claims on both Wasteland 3 and, rather randomly, Darkest Dungeon as well. Now, on the subject of copyright claims, I'm sure I've said this before, but I don't take it personally. It's just part of doing business on YouTube. But it does irk me a little when someone claims an entire video for what amounts to a 30 or 60-second segment of background music, especially when there's other stuff that's also going on at the same time. In the case of games like Disco Elysium or The Magistrate, I get it, they licensed music from a third party and it was my own fault for not doing my due diligence ahead of time. It sucks, but it happens. In other cases, though, it can get downright baffling. Wasteland 3, for example, has a soundtrack that is roughly 99% safe to use. The only song that ended up causing problems was a fragment of a third-party ambient track that only plays during random encounters. It seems to be blended with multiple other tracks too, so it's barely recognizable even when you listen to it side by side with the original source material, but the percussion line kept getting flagged. So essentially, I ended up having to waste hours and blow my monthly bandwidth going back and editing multiple episodes just to trim out those little 30-second segments that had that particular drum line playing in the background. Otherwise, all of the ad revenue for those hour-long episodes would end up being funneled to the third-party composer who had copyrighted that specific fragment of a blended track. In the case of Darkest Dungeon, it was actually even more disturbing, which I suppose is fitting given the nature of the game. I woke up one morning to find almost a dozen copyright claims filed against some of my oldest Darkest Dungeon videos, and as the day progressed, they continued filing more and more claims until it had almost taken over an entire page of my inbox. They were clearly working their way through my entire Darkest Dungeon playlist in chronological order, filing up to 3 claims per video, but only for the songs from the game's core soundtrack. They seem to be ignoring the soundtracks for the later DLC, like Crimson Court or The Color of Madness. Thankfully, it turned out that the explanation was pretty straightforward. While Red Hook and their lead composer, Stuart Chatwood, have long maintained an open policy of allowing content creators to use their music in gameplay videos, they also use third-party vendors to facilitate the sales and monetization for their standalone soundtracks. One of those vendors had just gotten a little overzealous and ended up running the main soundtrack through some sort of auto-claim program. It was basically going to town lodging complaints against every single Darkest Dungeon video in existence, in chronological order. Obnoxious, yes, but something that was eventually reversed once the actual composer got wind of what was happening. Mostly. I do still have claims on 2 videos, but I'm not really sure what I can do about that. So yeah, November was a bit slower than average, both because of the winter slump, as well as the what must have been at least a solid day or so I ended up having to waste on dealing with those copyright claims, not to mention the more complex games and the bugs that I had to deal with. But I can't really blame it all on that, because there was one other main contributing factor. Specifically, it's because our playlist for that month just didn't really have anything particularly new or exciting to offer. I mean, don't get me wrong, I've had a blast playing Baldur's Gate and Wasteland 3, but as we've seen in the past, anytime I get too bogged down with a couple of ongoing projects, the numbers will start to suffer. It's something that we saw not too long ago with Chimera Squad and Gears Tactics, 2 incredibly fun, if somewhat flawed games, that took us almost 3 months to grind through, during which time the numbers started to stagnate. While the numbers for both of those series were pretty solid when they first started, we were barely cracking 1,000 views per episode by the time they were both coming to an end. Content creators tend to see the best numbers when they're first starting a new series, or doing a brief dip into a game before quickly moving on to something else. There are, of course, exceptions, but sadly, on average, the longer a series drags on, the harder it becomes to maintain a decent level of audience retention. It's interesting because it leads to trying to find that perfect balance between wanting to stick with a project long enough to see if it's going to be successful, but also knowing when to bail on a series so you can potentially jump into something that will be more successful. It's a balance which I have obviously not yet mastered, and honestly one which I tend to resist when given half an opportunity, because I like finishing projects, even when they're not the most successful. That aside, I do still believe that there's a lot to be said for the benefit of actually finishing a series, especially something that's been running long term. Not only is it more gratifying for both myself and my viewers to see a series come to a final conclusion, but it can also end up helping that series gain a lot more traction in the months and years after it has officially ended. It's the same sort of thing I'm hoping to see with games like Wasteland 3, Kingmaker, and even Stygian when I eventually get around to completing that. And thankfully, that is where the Raiders, my patrons over on Patreon, are really helping out. I think I've mentioned it before, but their direct donations make up for the flagging ad revenue on some of these ongoing series, essentially allowing me to spend more time on finishing up my current ongoing projects, as opposed to instead being pressured to more efficiently cycle from one project to the next, while I try to keep those numbers up. Of course, that does mean that games like Baldur's Gate 3 do fit into a bit of a weird area. Because it's an early access build, it can never be truly finished, at least not in the same satisfying way that a full-fledged series can be. Some betas or EA builds are designed with this in mind. The alpha and beta builds for Wasteland 3, for example, were basically just self-contained demos. But then you have other games like Baldur's Gate 3 or Kingmaker, which instead offered a much broader slice of an overall campaign experience, but one where things became buggier and less polished the farther you progressed. In those cases, trying to grind through the entire thing might have actually made for a less satisfying experience, because as you progressed further and further, it would become increasingly broken and frustrating. That's not even getting into the other prominent issue, which is retreading familiar territory if and when I decide to do a full series. It's not as big a deal when it comes to games like Wasteland 3 or Stygian, where their early access builds were essentially just glorified demos. But in the case of a game like Baldur's Gate 3 or Kingmaker, there is going to be a much more significant amount of retread, even if I do make a completely new character, fill out my party with different characters, and try to deliberately make different decisions. It's the sort of thing that I really do have to keep in mind when it comes to how much time I invest in one of these early access builds, versus whether or not I want to return to the game once it is actually finished and hopefully polished for a full and proper series. In this particular case, I'm actually thankful that the decision for when to stop playing with the early access build was largely out of my hands. For those of you who missed the announcements, update number 3, which just came out last week, actually wiped all of our pre-existing saves. Sure, that's something I could have theoretically worked around. I mean, back when I was doing the old Kingmaker beta series, I think I actually had to rebuild our save files 3 separate times. But in this case, the game is still an estimated year from hitting full launch, and it's absolutely jam-packed with all sorts of unfinished and placeholder content. As much as I'd like to continue exploring it, and honestly, I would absolutely love to continue doing that, I do think we're better off waiting for them to at least fix some of those more prominent bugs, smooth out the mechanics, and add in a lot more content. I've actually mentioned it before, but we were just barely a third into the beta, and we're already right on the cusp of hitting the currently set level cap, so our upward growth was about to come to a dead stop. Likewise, Eluthen was supposed to be a Blade Warlock, but that's a subclass that literally isn't supported in the current version of the game. Add to that the simple fact that I was starting to run into more and more blocker bugs, which just outright prevented certain events from playing out properly. It seemed like a good excuse to go ahead and slide the series onto the back burner for a while. Mind you, that's not to say the series is actually over, but more that it just needs to simmer for a little while longer before we go in for another taste. When we do inevitably revisit the game, it will hopefully be a much smoother overall experience, with a version of Eluthen who is actually a Bladelock, and who can actually complete various key quests and, progress past level 4. At that point, we'll probably do another 10 or 12 episodes or so, but Again, I don't think the early access series will ever truly reach a proper end. More likely, we'll just end up bouncing off of it a couple of times throughout 2021, and then eventually hit that big reset button so we can give it a proper series once the game has hit full launch. Then, assuming it's well received by the viewers, we'll see if we can give it the full attention I think it's going to deserve. In the meantime, the other big advantage of even just temporarily pausing the series means that I have freed up production time for some of the numerous other projects that I have constantly cluttering my queue. I actually just finished running my monthly interest poll over on Patreon, and while Wasteland 3 has maintained its death grip on the number 1 slot, I was a little surprised to see that Solasta has worked its way up to number 2. This actually does make sense, because it's the other prominent CRPG that's going to be using the popular D&D 5th edition rule set. Baldur's Gate maintained a fairly solid grip on the number 2 slot right up until November, because the raiders wanted to see what it had to offer. Now that their curiosity has been sated, though, it's starting to slip down the rankings, and it's only natural that they would want to see how Solasta measures up in comparison. It is worth mentioning that I have actually touched on Solasta before, both with a quick little Kickstarter overview I made back when I first decided to back the project, but also a one-shot gameplay video showcasing their early prototype demo. The game has come a pretty long way since then, with the current early access build allowing you to make fully customized parties and offering up a solid 10 to 12 hours worth of content. That's easily enough to keep us busy for the better part of a month, but I think just short enough to not overstay its welcome. Oh, what else? Okay. I'll also note that, given how deep we've been getting into CRPGs lately, I have been kind of jonesing for another squad-level tactical game. I mean, I know it hasn't been that long since we burned through Chimera Squad and Gears Tactics, and Phoenix Point before that, but I have always liked the idea of running a CRPG in one slot and a tactical game in the other. Especially a tactical game that lets me insert viewers and raiders, so that I can then torture myself by inadvertently getting them killed. Sadly, while both Empire of Sin and Necromunda ended up being kind of a bust, and trust me, I am really trying to resist the urge to start griping about those right now, I do have my eye on Xenonauts 2, which should finally be hitting early access sometime late Q1 next year. I'm also kicking around the idea of revisiting Phoenix Point once the Festering Skies expansion comes out, because I recently started dabbling with that brand new Year 1 edition, and I have to say, while the game is still not perfect, it is definitely starting to move in the right direction. It's really coming along. Another tactical game that should be hitting early access next year is Cyberknights Flashpoint, a cyberpunk strategy game from the makers of Star Traders Frontiers. That is another project that I actually backed on Kickstarter, and one that I think has flown beneath a lot of people's radar so far. I'm really looking forward to giving that game some proper attention once I can finally get my hands on it, because despite being a very low-budget project, and I mean, it is important to maintain reasonable expectations, I still have a ton of faith in the developers behind it. I cannot stress that enough. At any rate, I think that touches on just about every single thing I wanted to talk about, and I can't help but notice that I have now been rambling for over 20 minutes on what was supposed to be a 15-minute video. So, you know what? Let's go ahead and start winding things down. Y'all know the drill by now. This is the part where I thank you for all your support. Not just the raiders, but also the rank and file viewers. Like I said, I've been doing this for over 3 years now, and that simply wouldn't be the case if it weren't for fine folks like you. Whether you're a longtime subscriber or a fresh new arrival, or even someone who hates 90% of my stuff but sticks around for that one specific series, the simple fact is that you have directly contributed to helping the channel grow. Look, it can be really easy to lose sight of the bigger picture on YouTube, especially during slower months like these. But all those likes, comments, and views do add up. Sure, ad revenue does tend to be pretty anemic these days, but it is still enough to cover the channel's basic overhead, with a little left over on the side for new games or to back new crowdfunding projects. Every new subscription also gives the channel a little more weight in the grand YouTube algorithm, providing yet another incremental boost for those slow but steady monthly gains. All that aside, though, I am thankful for the simple fact that not only do I get to spend time playing and rambling about the games that I love to play, but that I can also somehow pay a few of my bills while I'm doing it. I'm also thankful for the fact that so many people seem to genuinely enjoy listening to me ramble, which, don't get me wrong, is still super weird, but I am certainly not complaining. Then of course we've also got the Raiders, the fine folks who cut out the middleman and help fund the channel directly. I've mentioned them a couple of times throughout the video, and that is because they have actually become increasingly important over the past few months, ever since current events forced me to start re-evaluating how I approach certain things where the channel is concerned. Thankfully, since then, the Raiders have really stepped up. A significant portion of the money that they've been donating has been going directly towards funding my videos about games like Baldur's Gate 3 and Wasteland 3. Where I might have previously pulled the plug on both of those series back in early November when the numbers first started to flag, the Raiders allow me to continue forward without having to worry quite so much about the day-to-day analytics and ad revenue. Granted, that is still something that I have to keep in mind, but now it's more of a tertiary concern. Rather than being beholden to the grand YouTube algorithm quite so much, I can now spend more time focusing on content that I want to spend more time exploring, and on content that I know the Raiders would like to see. That is, after all, the main point of all those monthly interest polls. So, that said, special thanks to the honorary Raiders from October and November. A Normal Joe, a Dragon 707, Alexander Hochbaum, Austin Fagan, Benjamin Gray, Barat, Brad Quinn, CRX CRBS, Ego 2, Ethan Vonderweed, Flamebeard, ICU Uwu, Kim S. Jensen, Mark Giemza, Mark Richards, Matt Lietzen, Maximilian Monk, Mozzie Melton, Misha, Nerd Professor, Rob H., Roman Berger, Scott Brown, Sir Dialot, Stoltz, The White Winter Wolf, good name, and Tom Edward Idland. And extra special thanks to the veteran Raiders from October and November: AdriRaven, Alois, Ash, Ben Hollingshead, Drakiith, Eric Teichmiller, Exsellsior, James Trimmier, Jace Orcblood, Lady Shayna, Laura and Mike, Leroynukenson, Loki HLRMS, Loolaloo, Læknishendr, I am 90% certain I mispronounced that, Nod Goblin Nico, Optimal 2, Terry Williams, The Link King, TheBookThief, TK16151, Tomasz Piatkowski, Vertigo 322, Viktoriya Babenko, and Woe77. And of course, honorable mention to folks like Revenant, Anerdinwarpaint, Antonio Hernandez, Matthew Holmquist, Nathan Welch Jr., and Valinrook, the Raider captains. I've got to say, they went above and beyond, not just helping to support the channel and further enabling my growing addiction to energy drinks, but also by directly contributing towards my coverage of games like Baldur's Gate and Wasteland 3, as well as the likely future series such as Solasta and our eventual but inevitable return to games like Kingmaker. Thanks, guys. As always, if you would like to join the illustrious ranks of the Raiders, feel free to check out the links to my Patreon and PayPal accounts down in the description below. In fact, just this past month, my patrons have had exclusive access to not just the monthly interest polls that help me decide which projects to focus on, but they've also gotten access to other polls, including one about the future of the BG3 Early Access series, as well as an opportunity to recommend the characters for our upcoming dip into Solasta. It's not much, but it is the least I can do to thank them for their continued support. Anyway, that is slightly over my allotted time for shameless self-promotion, and my throat is starting to get a bit rough here, so I think we're pretty much done. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and we'll get back in just another day or two for more gameplay content. Probably another Wasteland 3 vid, whilst I continue laying groundwork for other upcoming projects. See you then. Oh, and of course, remember, if you need to reach me for any reason, then feel free to leave a comment on this or any of my other videos. You can also contact me directly on Discord, Facebook, Patreon, Twitter, or through my official email address. As always, links are in the description.